Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.
Tonight, Jeff Bezos buys MGM Studios for $8.5 billion. Joe Livonia, chief economist for the National Economic Council, talks to us about inflation. And this week, the Dow Jones is 125 years old, but doesn't look a day over 100. That and more tonight, all on Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up, and hope your week went well. I'm Andre Laborde. Our goal is bringing Wall Street to your street. For today, Friday, May the 28th, 2021. And to get you ready for the events ahead for next week. We've got a great show for you this evening, so stick around. Tonight, we'll be talking with Joe Livonia. Joe is an economist. He was a special assistant to the president under Donald Trump and was chief economist on the National Economic Council, advising the director, Larry Kudlow, on the economy. And he will be with us this evening. But first, how did the markets do this week? Well, all the major averages closed on higher on their final trading day of May. Remember, the markets will be closed on Monday for Memorial Day. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average ended the week at 34,530, up 64 points for the day and up just under 0.9 of a point for the week. And the S&P 500 closed today at 4,156, up 3 points for the day and up 1.1% for the week. And finally, the Nasdaq. They finished the week at 13,748, up 12 points for the day and up for the week just over 2%. The Dow Jones and the S&P 500 posted monthly gains, but the Nasdaq posted their first monthly loss in 6 months. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 had their fourth straight monthly gain. And Bitcoin, Bitcoin closed for the week ending today at $35,994. It was dropping just over $200 for the week. Well, let's get to our guest tonight. Joe Livonia was chief economist of the National Economic Council under Director Larry Kudlow. He was also special assistant to the president under Donald Trump, and he's presently chief economist for the Americas at Natixis. And he's here with us this evening. Hi, Joe. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Thank you.
We've got right now, with so much stimulus money coming into the circulation, plus we've got employers ramping back up and making inventory that there was none of for the last 12 months. Is there too much money in the system chasing too few goods?
There are certainly bottlenecks on the goods side, and that to me is what is driving some of the inflation we're seeing on the goods side, in part because people haven't been able to buy services because they've been restricted on going to restaurants, live entertainment, travel, so they've been buying a lot of goods, and the spending on goods is well above its long-term trend, and that's causing bottlenecks, which in turn are causing higher prices, which I expect this to be temporary. What I've noticed, though, in terms of all the liquidity you talk about, which you see in rapid M2 growth, which is running upwards of 25-26%, those are numbers that we really have never, ever seen in the history of the series. A lot of that money is going into equity markets where you see significant inflows, and also other asset markets, collectibles, crypto, etc. So really the inflation we've seen has been really more on the asset side and less on the traditional goods and services side.
Is that why, Joe, you find the Federal Reserve is still stating that they're not going to be thinking about raising interest rates until 2023, as I said before?
That's part of it. I mean, the Fed has had this approach really that began under Ben Bernanke, continued with Janet Yellen, of course, has gone into overdrive with Jay Powell, and that is that they're trying to do everything they can to get that inflation rate to 2%. In this case, the Fed has actually recently changed its approach. They want inflation to run a bit above 2%. Unfortunately, monetary policy is a blunt tool, and the Fed has not been able to generate inflation where it wants it. It's gone other places, asset prices in particular, which arguably has caused significant inequality issues. And this is what we're seeing with central banks the world over, and that is you can't get inflation always where you want it in traditional goods and service prices. ECB has undershot its inflation mandate for over a decade. The Bank of Japan has been going on a couple of decades with inflation just around 0%. So the central banks want inflation, but they haven't been able to get it.
Well, I know Jay Powell is up for renomination next year, and I'm sure he wants to be renominated and continuing the way things are. So, do you think that politics has anything to do with it?
Politics, the world we're seeing politics front and center, especially with as much divisiveness now in the U.S. And the Treasury and the Fed have never worked in recent times as close together as they are now. You'd have to go back to the Fed Treasury Court of the early 50s, and before that, World War II, when the Fed effectively financed the war by keeping Treasury yields pegged at very low levels. Having said that, I do believe that Jay Powell believes that the best approach is a very accommodative monetary policy. In a perfect world, or in a different world, we'd have one where the Fed would start to ease off that accelerator once the emergency was over. But we're kind of stuck in this trap where the Fed seemingly cannot get rates much above zero. Even in the last cycle, interest rates, the Fed funds rate barely went above 2%. So I think, honestly, the Fed believes what it is doing is good. I don't think it's political per se, but unfortunately, I don't think it's the right policy. But at this stage, they've been doing it so long, and other central banks have followed, I'm not sure they could change the playbook.
Well, this week right here, Richard Clarida and also Mary Daly, I think she's the Federal Reserve Governor out of San Francisco, were saying that they would be open for discussions on possibly either reducing or eliminating the bond purchases of $120 billion a month that the Treasury is doing. They didn't say they were for it. They just said that they were, I think the way they phrased it was, they would be open to debate it. Do you think that's the first to go before they would start raising interest rates?
Yeah, yes, for sure. But it shows you the kind of crazy world we're in, where they're thinking about doing something. I mean, this is extraordinary wordsmithing. It's extraordinary wordsmithing, and it reflects the fact that the Fed has become such a dominant buyer of Treasury securities, and that has forced interest rates down. It's pushed people into risky assets in particular stocks, which is why we have the equity market capitalization as a share of GDP higher than it's been any time in the past. And therefore, the Fed is worried that if it was to dial back its accommodation too quickly, if they were to taper those bond purchases and lessen those purchases, they could have a sizable pullback in markets, which then could impact the economy down the line. This is going to be a very, very delicate act. Jay Powell is walking a tightrope with it because, unlike under Bernanke, when the balance sheet was rising and only at roughly, I say only 20% of GDP, now it's close to 40 and is likely to grow. But what's really interesting is if the Biden administration gets as much fiscal stimulus as it's trying to get, as it's working through Congress now, that Congress is working on writing the legislation for these two big bills, I don't see how the Fed could possibly taper because the deficits already are so large. Someone is going to need to buy those deficits without rates spiking, and that's likely to be the Fed.
There's about $3 trillion globally in cash just flooding the economy. I'm sure some of it will go towards equities, and they're hoping for it to be going into the economy. But this is what I'm assuming, which is also causing people seeing prices rise, from everything from a gallon of gas to lumber to eggs and milk, right?
No, that's correct. I mean, inflation's running about 4% is the headline rate. Again, I'm saying it's temporary, that this is really more of a post-pandemic, if you will, price level adjustment, because demand came back much faster than many people thought. In the Trump administration, when we were there, we thought the economy was very healthy, and that once it was allowed to reopen, you were going to get much faster growth, and that's what happened. And producers now have been gradually catching up to it. But where I see a lot of the inflation are, again, asset markets. I'll give you a great example. I love baseball. Mickey Mantle rookie card 5 years ago sold for $300,000, which is quite a sum of money. And apparently it recently sold for $5.5 million. So you're correct. You've got all this money chasing too few things to buy. household bank accounts are themselves up over $2 trillion in the past 12 months. So yes, there's a lot of money that's there sloshing around and is going into asset markets. But the great irony is if asset markets ever correct, because their price movement is dislodged for fundamentals, what does the Fed do in that environment? They either continue easing or ease even more to support those asset markets.
Joe, when you were at the NEC and you were at the White House, I mean, the unemployment rate was what, 3.4, 3.3%? This is pre-pandemic.
3.5%.
3.5%. You had the lowest unemployment for African American, lowest unemployment for Hispanics, lowest female unemployment for in like a 30-year period. It was
70 years.
70. Okay, I dropped off 40. That's important. An extra 40 years, so for 70 years. Do you think that even with what the Biden administration is trying to do now, the economy was so strong and wants to get back to work so bad that no matter what type of tax increases that they'll want to put on, it won't damage the engine of capitalism?
Yeah. I'm not sure about that, because the other point I'd make is while you had those record low unemployment rates, we also saw in detailed census data through 2019, the last year for which we have these numbers, a record increase in living standards for those exact same demographic or race groups that you highlight. And we believe that reflects a very pro-business, deregulatory approach, in addition to a reduction in marginal tax rates and a reduction in corporate tax rates, where ultimately workers saw the benefit of that through higher productivity, which translated into higher wages. And unfortunately, if we're going down a more anti-growth route, I do fear that we will do damage to the economy's longer-term trajectory. The Biden administration has some very good timing, good for them. They got a very healthy, recovering economy. And yes, there's certain things we need to do on the infrastructure side. It's bipartisan, but let's go down that route and leave the economy alone. And you could take credit for it if you'd like, but at least everybody else will be better off because the policies will be pro-growth.
So true. What about the corporate tax rate? It was higher. It's right now at 21% with the Trump tax cuts, and right now Joe Biden wants to bring it up to 28%. Although if Joe Manchin holds his ground, it'll only stay up to like 25%. But whether it's 25% or 28%, how hard of an economic hit do you think that will do with the economy if they bring it up to 25%?
I mean, I'd like to see corporate rates even lower than 21%, but certainly 25 is better than 28, which is better than 35, which is where it was. But keep in mind that we're looking at potentially significant further increase in marginal rates that could actually wind up lifting capital gains to over 43%. Some states, such as New York, where I am, have effective capital gains rates that are significantly above that, which will hurt capital formation, which will hurt productivity growth, and ultimately come back and hurt workers. And there's another issue. If every 4 years or 8 years when new administrations come in and out, we change tax policy, even if it's by 4%, let's say we go 21 to 25, that will impact long-term corporate decision-making, because who's to say that the next time or the next administration that comes in either wants to take it lower, which could impact what people decide to do now, or even worse, take it higher, which would further crimp activity. So it would be nice if we could just leave tax policy alone. What we've seen over time is that the revenue share of GDP does not change. It's about 17%. That's what it was from very early on up to 95. It's what it is from very early on to present. We had a couple of booms in the 90s where it went above that, but we basically always settle in around 17%. So it's not really a tax and revenue problem. It's really more of a spending problem.
I would wish that they would certainly keep it at 21%, because what I'm concerned now, I'm reading where the Biden administration is talking with other countries, with the G7, to have a global tax rate so that they won't have the inversions that they had before. So their headquarters do not necessarily have to be in the United States. Their headquarters can be, let's say, in Ireland, that has, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's a 12.5% tax rate. So their headquarters can be in Ireland or in other areas, but they sell globally. What that 21% did was that brought their headquarters from other areas where they had the inversions to the United States. Would that be summarizing it correctly? Okay.
Yeah, that's perfectly put. And it also, if it stays, it will also encourage more onshoring of U.S. manufacturing, which pays much higher than average wage rates, which then will ripple throughout the economy. We have to think of taxes a little bit like water, always seeking its lowest place. Gravity will seek where the lowest point is, and therefore, you could try all you might for a global minimum tax, but there's always going to be some location or jurisdiction that's going to have a lower tax, and that's where ultimately capital will gravitate towards. So I just think we need to figure out the best tax policy we can to get the economy growing as quickly as it can, so that it can generate the revenues we want to pay for the things we want, and reward entrepreneurialism and dynamism, which the U.S. economy has a whole lot of, and not penalize the successful people in the process.
True. And also with that, after the Trump tax cuts were passed, a lot of other countries around the world, they too lowered their tax rates so they could be competitive. Well, if we're starting to raise ours to whatever it may wind up at, and hopefully it doesn't, but whether it be 25 or 28 or anything above what it is now, 21, again, we're going right back into the non-competitive stage of where we were prior.
Yes. I mean, it's not helping, and that's the thing. I mean, the economy is still recovering. The Fed is so fearful to raise rates and do anything to hurt the recovery. Why in the world would you undertake massive fiscal outlays that really aren't stimulating at this point? At the same time, you're raising taxes. That would be very anti-Keynesian, which I'm not a Keynesian, but that would be general macro policymakers don't want to do those things. The time to raise taxes or cut spending is when the economy already has fully recovered, and we're still far away from that. We've still got about 8 million jobs that are below the pre-pandemic peak, so we still have some wood to chop.
Joe, before we go to a break, I'm just curious. I mean, in 1962, John F. Kennedy, Democrat president, said, the way to increase the economy and spur growth is through lower taxation. But it looks like today, John Kennedy today couldn't be elected not only president, but he couldn't get the Democrat nomination or the Senate seat in Massachusetts. You've been in Washington, D.C. Is it just because they understand this, but it has to be the opposite of what the Republican Party wants? Or what's the logic behind it?
Well, my boss, Larry Kudlow, the book is right behind me, actually, the JFK Revolution. And, JFK and Ronald Reagan had some very similar economic policies. And the whole point is you'd want to just, what can you do to increase the size of the pie so you give people more of what they want? And we'd actually have less argument and debate, Democrats and Republicans, if they had more to choose from. I'm not sure why it's devolved into the situation it has. I mean, I don't know if it's just because of the world we're in. I don't actually know. It was probably we should have another conversation on it. I wish I had a good answer for it. I don't.
Yeah. Well, that's okay. I don't have a good answer for it either, Joe. It's all right. If you're just joining us, we're talking with Joe Livonia. We're so happy to have him. He is with the Natixis, but he was formerly with the White House, with the NEC. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back right after this. And if you're just joining us, glad to have you. We're here with Joe Livonia. He was formerly with the NEC, Special Counsel of the President. When we're very happy to have him, we're talking about taxes, raising the corporate tax rates, the possibility of higher taxation. Joe, what about right now? The Congress passed, and consumers are getting an extra $300 a week in unemployment checks. That's in addition to what the state is paying, and employers all around the country are begging for employees, and they're offering sign-up. It's like the NFL. They're offering sign-up bonuses. They're offering extra cash if you sign on the dotted line. Have you heard any word? Do the Democrats want to, in September, when this ends, to do this again, this continuation, or will they even stop it, you think, before September 30th?
I'm not sure they'll stop it before September, although there are 23 states right now that have elected not to take those federal extended benefits, and a couple more in the next 4 to 6 weeks will be joining. So roughly half the nation won't have it. My guess is that by the time we get to September, and in New York City, for example, the mayor just announced that everybody's going to be back at school working in person. So therefore, people have childcare. There shouldn't be a concern there about, what are they going to do with their kids. And at the same time, of course, cases, thank God, have come down and vaccine distribution's increased. So all the reasons why people don't want to go back to work or can't go back to work should dissipate. And this is a reason why I was saying earlier, Andre, we're going to see some of those bottlenecks on labor dissipate, because you're exactly right. There's a real demand for labor. There are over 8 million job openings right now in the U.S. that would essentially fix all the lost employment that we had in the past 12 months. That's a record reading. So I think we're on the road to recovery, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed that these benefits will indeed expire in September.
And Joe, what I'm concerned also is that when those $300 additional weekly benefits end, which will be at the end of September, there are going to be so many people waiting to the very end. And when the last check comes out, that's when they're going to go looking for work, which means, again, talking about a bottleneck, then there'll be a bottleneck of all of a sudden there'll be so many unemployed workers looking for jobs rather than looking for jobs right now when there are employers begging for employees.
That's right. But, as we're talking about this, what we're saying is people respond to incentives. Mm-hmm. So if they can collect money and then get a job soon thereafter and get even more money, thankfully, because there's strong labor demand, why wouldn't they also respond to changes in tax rates, whether it's capital gains rates, marginal income tax rates, or the corporate tax rates? Institutions, individuals, entities, business agents, if you will, respond to incentives. And this is another reason why we need to set the best policy to give us the most growth to pay for the programs that we so desperately want and need.
Joe, also right now that the Biden administration wants to add about 87,000 new IRS agents. And what they're saying is that over a 10-year period, and for our viewers, everything is over, and as you know, in government, everything is over a 10-year period. They're saying that this will bring in about $700 billion in additional revenue. Do you think that's pie in the sky, or do you think that this would be worthwhile? Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, well, here's the thing. I mean, one of the authors of that study you're referring to was done with a noted Harvard economist, had looked at the data, and the irony is when they first started looking at it, the revenue share of GDP has been increasing in the last handful of years, and it's going to go back up to, again, its historical average, about 17.5%. So there's no evidence that in the aggregate, there's all of this tax avoidance. If there was, we would see that revenue number be a lot higher than what it is. So I don't think you're going to get the revenues that people expect. That almost always happens. It's sort of on paper, you think you might get it. It's sort of like cutting out waste and abuse is going to save X billions of dollars. It sounds good to some folks, but inevitably it never really works.
We recently had Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who was former director of the Congressional Budget Office on, and we talked to him about, in government, it's over a 10-year period. This will save X amount of dollars over 10 years. Nothing. A good battle plan is only good for the first 30 seconds. So who knows what the government is going to happen or what's going to happen in this country in 2 years from now or 3 years from now. So it only sounds good on paper, for.
That's right.
For 10
Well, it's
years.
a business cycle away. It's a business cycle away. The best way to actually avoid tax avoidance, is not have it, is to lower taxes and simplify the tax code. Lower taxes to the extent you're able to, broaden the base, help out the less fortunate through earned income tax credit and other various subsidies if need be. But making the tax code more complex just is a recipe for avoidance. So we're doing sort of the exact opposite things, and hiring more agents I don't believe to be the answer. I think what we need to do is need to figure out ways, as I said earlier, to grow the pie, and that's a much more efficient way to do it than just assuming people aren't paying their taxes. Because, by the way, if you're going after very, very wealthy individuals, they have the best opportunity to move to other jurisdictions where tax rates are much lower. We're seeing it intra-U.S. with people moving from many of the high state taxes, such as New York, New Jersey, California, to much more business-friendly places like Texas and Florida. that could happen on an even grander scale outside the U.S. conceivably.
Joe, I completely agree. In fact, you were just talking where money flows like water to where it's most appreciated. And with Florida even picking up a congressional seat, and I think Texas picked up 2 congressional seats, and for the first time since, 1850, California lost a congressional seat. I'm sure that sent shockwaves through the California legislature when they found out that they've lost a representative for the first time in over 150 or 170 years.
Yeah, although one thing I would say about California, it's got a lot better weather than New York. And New York has much higher taxes now, thanks to recent legislation than California. So maybe you get some New Yorkers to move to California.
That's it. Joe, I got time for just one more question for you. What about SALT, which is state and local taxes? There's a couple of Democrat areas that they will not vote from, without the reduction of SALT, which is a state and local tax up to $10,000 is the max you can go. And of course, Bernie Sanders and the far left and the Progressive Party, they don't want to get rid of SALT. Do you think that's on the chopping block, or do you think that pretty much will stay?
I don't know the answer. It's kind of funny. You've got Bernie Sanders and the GOP.
Isn't it, though? Talk about strange bedfellows.
Strange bedfellows. That's exactly right. What's interesting when you raise SALT, and that is that people talk about the Senate. You mentioned Joe Manchin earlier from West Virginia, Kristen Sinema from Arizona as being kind of key swing votes. But actually, the House might be more important. Right now, there are 8. The Democrats have an 8-seat advantage. There are 5 vacancies. I'm not sure when those are going to be filled. But you only might need 5, at most 5, potentially less if some of these seats get filled, Democrats crossing over. And that actually might be more important to whether this legislation that's working through Congress gets passed. In other words, the roadblock might be in the House and not in the Senate, which I think too much of the financial media focused on what's happening in the Senate, focus more on the House. But it's going to be very interesting. And by the way, we also need to pass the debt ceiling sometime this summer, which could be a prelude to how these fiscal battles are going to maybe play out in the fall.
True. Well, Joe, all that means is that we want you back again to talk to us, especially when it comes time for raising of the debt ceiling, and there'll be much more to talk about. I hope you come back and join us. Thank you, Joe.
Andre, I would love to come back, and thank you very much for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
My guest, thanks so much. I appreciate that, to Joe Livonia, former chief economist for the NEC. Well, if you've got a question about finance or a comment about the show, we'd love to hear from you. You can write us at andre@wallstreetwrapup.info. Keep it pithy or concise. We'll be glad to answer your questions. And now for a look ahead for next week. But first, this billionaire fashion designer got his start selling neckties out of a drawer in the Empire State Building. Who is it? We'll have the answer for you in just a minute. Stay tuned. This billionaire fashion designer got his start selling neckties out of a drawer in the Empire State Building. Who is it? The answer? Ralph Lauren. Well, join me next week when my guest will be William Cohen. Bill has numerous bestsellers and is also a contributor to Vanity Fair. He's written a piece in this month's Vanity Fair on General Electric. In fact, he's writing a book on General Electric right now. We're going to talk about that and a lot more. But he'll be here next week, my guest, William Cohen. And that's our show. I hope you've enjoyed it for Friday, May the 28th, 2021. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook and WYES.org. So thank you for joining us and allowing us into your homes tonight. And by the way, have a great Memorial weekend. For Wall Street Wrap-Up, I'm Andre Laborde. Remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.